Hello, class, and welcome back to the second part of our lecture on the gross anatomy of the brain. What we've taken a look at so far is looked at a lot of vocabulary as well as the overall larger cephalonic structures of the brain and the divisions into the various lobes, and we've also taken a look at the frontal lobe and its specific function. So we're going to continue on now with the other lobes. And the next lobe that we're going to take a look at is the parietal lobe. And this is a remarkable region of the brain responsible for sensory processing, spatial awareness, as well as attention. And so the parietal lobe plays a crucial role in understanding the body's position in space, interpreting sensory information, and guiding our interactions in the environment. So the parietal lobe is located near the top and back of the brain, often referred to as the brain's association cortex, because it integrates sensory information from various sources to create a coherent perception of the world around us. So there are some various functions of the parietal lobe. There is, of course, the somatosensory processing. So the parietal lobe houses the primary somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for processing tactile sensations from different parts of the body. And this includes touch and pressure and temperature and, of course, pain. And the mapping of the body surface on this cortex, known as the sensory homunculus, reflects the degree of sensitivity of different parts of the body regions. As you know, different parts of your body are more sensitive to touch than are others. Then, of course, there is the spatial awareness. And within the parietal lobe, spatial awareness is an instrumental function for understanding our body's position relative to the environment. And so it's essential for coordinating movements, reaching for objects, and navigating through space. It's also important for attention and perception. So the parietal lobe contributes to our ability to focus our attention on a specific stimuli. Of course, attention is a much more complex issue, and we'll get into that later on. But it helps us essentially to filter out distractions. It plays a role in directing our attention to the relevant information and integrating it with our other sensory inputs. Interestingly, the parietal lobe also plays, to some extent, processing of numbers and math. There are some regions with the parietal lobe that have been identified as being involved in numerical cognition and mental mathematic processing. So our mental arithmetic and understanding numerical relationships is processed to a large extent in the parietal lobe. So there's some interesting research about the parietal lobe and its relationship to our relationships with our body. So one intriguing insight from research involving the parietal lobe is its involvement with our perception of body ownership. And neuroscientists have conducted experiments to study the brain's response to visual and tactile stimuli. So there's one very interesting study where researchers used the rubber hand illusion. So there's a phenomenon in which participants perceive a rubber hand as their own when it's stroked in synchrony with their real hand. And so functional MRI scans during this illusion revealed increased activity in the parietal lobe, suggesting its role in integrating visual and tactile information to create a coherent sense of body ownership. And this sheds light on how the parietal lobe contributes to our fundamental understanding of our own bodies and their interactions with the real world. Now, there can also be some clinical implications of parietal lobe damage. So Damage to the parietal lobe can lead to a condition called hemispatial neglect, where the individual will ignore or fail to acknowledge one side of essentially their visual field of their body. And this condition really underscores the parietal lobe's role in things like spatial awareness and attention. So I want to kind of continue by just considering a fairly well-documented clinical case of hemispatial neglect, and patient known as Mrs. A. And Mrs. A suffered from damage to the parietal lobe, particularly the right parietal cortex, leading to a profound inability to attend to and perceive one side of their visual field, so often the left side. So with Mrs. A as a patient who suffered from a stroke that caused damage to the right parietal lobe of her brain, after the stroke, she exhibited this very severe hemispatial neglect. In fact, sometimes forgetting to move her left foot or her left arm, forgetting that she even had a left foot or left arm. Another example was when she was asked to draw a clock, she would only draw the numbers on the right side and leave the left side blank. And when served a meal, she would only eat the food on the right side of the plate, and as if the left side of the plate food didn't even exist. And so that just gives us some sense that there are lots of implications of things that the parietal lobe does. Parietal lobe is involved in spatial awareness and attention. It highlights the fact that it's possible to neglect or not even recognize the reality of something simply because of its relationship to your body. It highlights the importance of the integration of sensory information, the multi-sensory integration, and how that plays a role within hemispatial neglect. And it also helps us to understand how we can focus our treatments for patients that are suffering from hemispatial neglect. So we can focus on therapies that stimulate neglected areas and encourage patients to consciously attend to their neglected side. And so this can start to aid in recovery. And of course, it also highlights the importance of neuroplasticity, because in some cases of people like Mrs. A, it highlights that the brain has a remarkable ability to reorganize itself, to rewire itself and adapt so that the individual can function better. So that's a little bit about the parietal lobe. Let's go on now and take a look at the occipital lobe. And within the occipital lobe, we have the gateway to vision. Now, situated in the back of the cerebral cortex, or the back of your head, the occipital lobe plays really essential role in our ability to see and to interpret visual information. And so it's the primary destination of visual information that enters the brain, making it a central hub for processing and understanding the sensory input received from our eyes. So there is some various functions of the occipital lobe. The first one, of course, is the primary visual cortex. The primary visual cortex, also known as V1 or the striate cortex, is located in the occipital lobe, and it's the first region to receive visual information in the eye. And so the V1 processes basic visual features like edges and lines and orientation of objects. And so neurons here are organized in a way that creates a visual map of the world, and this is called retinotopic mapping on the brain. Now there's other parts. One, I think it's V5, don't quote me on that, but it basically puts movement together. So if there's damage, for example, to the V5 area, you just see these still pictures, one after another. So it's like living in a room with a strobe light, a very slow strobe light. Then, of course, there is, within the occipital lobe, is visual perception. And so the occipital lobe contains higher order visual areas responsible for more complex aspects of visual perception. So these areas process information, say things like related to color and motion and depth and object recognition. So what happens when you have damage to an area of the occipital lobe? Well, that can result in something known as visual agnosia, where individuals struggle to recognize familiar objects, and prosopagnosia, where they can't recognize faces, even though other aspects of their visual processing remain intact. Then there is also motion processing, which I've already mentioned. It helps us not only to have a sense of smooth processing, helps us watch movies and TV, helps us to perceive and track movement within our visual field. And so there's a lot that the occipital lobe does for us. Now, I want to kind of just highlight a little bit with a little bit of research on the occipital lobe. So one intriguing insight from research involves the occipital lobe is the discovery of the occipital face area, the OFA. Now, there's something known as the fusiform face area in the temporal lobe that has traditionally been associated with facial recognition. But there's been some recent studies that identify a region in the occipital lobe that also appears to contribute to this process. So we have found through functional MRI studies that the occipital face area responds specifically to faces, suggesting that facial recognition is not exclusively localized in the temporal lobe, but it's a combination of temporal and occipital lobe functioning. And so, as I've mentioned, there can be visual processing disorders. So damage or dysfunction of the occipital lobe can lead to various visual processing disorders. For example, damage to the V1 region can result in blind spots in the visual field. Conditions like achromatopsia can lead to color blindness due to impaired colored processing in the occipital lobe. And then, of course, there's the case of the man who mistook his wife for a hat, as famously described by the psychiatrist and author Oliver Sacks, who really kind of provided a poignant illustration of the profound impact of visual agnosia and its connection to the function of the occipital lobe. So, Dr. Oliver Sacks documented the case of a music teacher, I believe it was, referred to as Dr. P, who suffered from a condition called visual agnosia. And Dr. P had a remarkable ability to recognize objects when he focused his attention on their individual features. However, when it came to perceiving the whole and forming coherent visual scenes, he really kind of struggled. Now, in a particularly striking incident, Dr. P mistook his wife for a hat and attempted to lift her head as if it was an inanimate object. Now, he could identify individual facial features, but he could not integrate them into a meaningful whole, and so that kind of resulted in this really perplexing behavior. Let's go on now and take a look at the temporal cortex. Within the temporal cortex, we have this sprawling expanse of neural tissue within the temporal lobe that's really characterized by its intricate organization and its involvement in an array of cognitive processes. Now remember, there's lateralization here, and there's probably more lateralization in the temporal lobe than in others. Basically, this is how I describe it. Your right temporal lobe is your private self. Your left temporal lobe is your public self. So if you think of it that way, you have a better sense of how this is all divided up. Now, what is the temporal lobe involved in? Well, first off, auditory processing. The primary auditory cortex is situated, yes, in the temporal cortex, and is responsible for receiving and processing auditory information from the ears, and so it helps distinguish between different sounds and tones and frequencies, and contributes to our sense of hearing. It also helps in language comprehension. So the temporal cortex, especially in the left hemisphere, is really vital for language comprehension. Now, the Wernicke area, found in the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus, is involved in understanding spoken and written word, and then so the damage to this area can result in Wernicke's aphasia, where individuals have difficulty comprehending language. It also helps with memory encoding and retrieval. So the temporal cortex, particularly the structure underneath it, which is the hippocampus within the medial temporal lobe, is central to processing. And it helps encode new information into memory, and really is crucial for retrieving memories. So the hippocampus's intricate connections allow us to form memories, to hold on to information for a period of time, to add emotions to that information, and for the formation of our thoughts. It also plays a role in facial recognition, as I've already mentioned. There's different areas of the temporal cortex that are responsible for recognizing objects and faces and visual stimuli. So we have that area of the fusiform face area, the FFA, for instance, is dedicated to identifying faces, while other parts help us recognize and distinguish various objects. It also helps with our social cognition and emotion. So there's certain areas of the temporal cortex, areas associated to things like the superior temporal sulcus, contribute to social cognition by processing social cues and helping us understand gestures and emotional expressions. And this supports our ability to understand and connect with others on an emotional level. Now, I want to kind of look at the right temporal cortex, because this has to do with our private self in some ways, as well as the social dimensions, while the left temporal lobe has more to do with the language processing. So the right temporal lobe is involved largely with processing spatial information, emotional recognition, has many areas that help us process emotions, particularly understanding and recognizing emotions in others. It also has to do with that fusiform face area, as well as the theory of the mind and social cognition. So the right temporal lobe is really involved in thinking about thinking, our ability to attribute mental states to others and understand their perspectives. And so this region enables us to make inferences about others' thoughts and feelings and intentions, and so support complex social interactions. Now, there's some interesting research into the right temporal cortex and its emotional processing, where it helps us to. So in one study, we looked at imaging emotions. So it suggested that and it really lit up this area. So it suggests that it contributes to emotional interpretation. And when patients with damage to the right temporal lobe will also often exhibit deficits in recognizing emotions from facial expressions and body language. And this highlights really the critical role that this region plays in understanding and responding to emotional signals. Now let's shift to the cerebral cortex. Sorry, not the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum. Oh, so many terms. The cerebellum originates from Latin, which basically means the little brain. Now, despite its relatively small size compared to the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum plays a crucial role in coordinating movement and maintaining balance and even contributing to certain cognitive functions. So, if you understand my joke now, I made a joke where the cerebellum was a little unbalanced. Well, that's because that's the role of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum really kind of resembles a small cauliflower-like structure nestled beneath the cerebral hemispheres. But it's a powerhouse of precision and control and coordination. So despite its compact size, it contains really an astonishing number of neurons. But all of them kind of work independently of the rest of us. It allows us to be the super athlete or the super skilled tradesperson. Someone that's really good with their hands with something is really using their cerebellum in a lot of ways. And that's part of the reason why you can have someone, say, for example, that has frontal lobe damage, so they have trouble with higher order functioning, but they can still be, an amazing potter, for example, or great at knitting because their cerebellum is working just fine. So one of the things that the cerebellum does is works with motor coordination. So the cerebellum is primarily responsible for coordinating the voluntary movement. It doesn't initiate the voluntary movement, it coordinates things. It fine-tunes things. It adjusts the timing and the force and the direction of movement so that you're not consciously thinking about these things. And so it allows for precise performance of motor tasks. And this can be anything from sitting down, to writing, to picking up a glass, to playing a musical instrument. It also has to do with our maintaining our balance and our posture. It processes sensory information from the inner ear and the muscles and joints and adjusts our body posture and makes very swift corrections to help prevent us from falling. So we don't have to be consciously thinking about falling or walking or reaching for a door and all the little intricate movements that we would have to do. Now, if we have damage to our cerebellum, then if we are to function, we need to consciously think about these things, and that makes life very slow and very difficult. So the cerebellum is also involved in motor learning. It's about acquiring new motor skills, and that's why practice makes perfect when you're doing motor skills, particularly in refining movements over time. And it also plays a particular role in coordinating cognitive functions. And so there's an implication that it plays partial role in things like attention and language processing, and even some aspects of emotional regulation. So there's a lot of things that the cerebellum can do. But primarily, it is about coordination, motor coordination. Now, I want to kind of just go on and highlight a little bit about the central nervous system. So we're going to wrap up our exploration of the brain and behavior here today by looking at the organization of the central nervous system. So the CNS, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, plays a central role in processing information and coordinating bodily functions and facilitating our complex behaviors. So the central nervous system, I keep saying this, it's the command center of the body. It's who we are. There's the brain. The brain is the control center of the CNS. It's divided into those several major areas, each responsible for its specific functions, such as perception, motor control, emotion, cognition, language, and so on. The brain is divided up into the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, each with distinct structures and functions. The forebrain includes the cerebral cortex, the thalamus and hypothalamus. It's responsible for complex cognitive functions such as sensory processing and regulation of vital bodily functions. There's the midbrain, which is involved in relaying sensory and motor information and contributing to aspects of hearing, vision, and movement control. And then the hindbrain, which comprises the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And so it's responsible for coordinating also motor functions, balance, and of course regulating essential bodily functions like our heart beating and things like breathing. And then there is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord, as we know, is that long cylindrical bundle of nerves that extends from the brainstem and runs down the cerebral, vertebral column, the backbone. And it serves as the communication conduit between the brain and the rest of the body. And so the sensory information from the body is transmitted to the brain through the spinal cord, while motor commands from the brain travel down to control muscles and organs. Now, there's the functional segmentation of the sensory and motor pathways. So we have the central nervous system is organized into distinct sensory and motor pathways that facilitate the transmission of information and motor control. We have the sensory pathways, and so the sensory information from the body is gathered by specialized receptors and sent to the central nervous system. And these pathways carry information about touch and temperature and pain and proprioception, which is the sense of our body position, as well as much more information. And this information is processed and integrated and contributes to our perception of the environment. And then there is the motor pathways. And the motor pathways convey commands from the brain to muscles and glands. And they enable voluntary movements, reflex actions, and the regulation of bodily functions. And the brain's motor areas initiate commands which are transmitted through the spinal cord to, of course, the appropriate muscles. So we've explored the cerebral cortex with its distinct lobes, the frontal and parietal and occipital and temporal lobes, each contributing uniquely to the cognitive abilities in motor control and perception. And let's not forget the little brain, the cerebellum, ensuring coordination and precision in our movements and potentially even impacting our cognitive functioning. So remember to keep track of the lobes in the cerebellum. And we can do that using a simple mnemonic device. F-pot-C. And so what I like to do is just F would be frontal lobe, P for parietal lobe, O for occipital lobe, T for temporal lobe, and C for cerebellum. So with F-pot-C in mind, I like to encourage students to give a little tap to your forehead. That's your F. And then pot is the top of your head, the back of your head, the side of your head. And then C, you tap the bottom back of your head again. So you go F, pot, C, by tapping those different parts of your head. And it very easily helps you to remember your lobes. Now, let's see if you can appreciate my humor. Now, remember one of my jokes? Why did the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe refuse to invite the cerebellum to the party? Because they heard that he was a little too unbalanced on the dance floor. Get it? Unbalanced. Because the cerebellum is responsible for coordination and balance. There you go. So he wasn't doing his job. Okay, I hope you enjoyed our lecture for this week, and I will see you next week. You take care. Goodbye.